To make it simple to reuse code and components across Nuxt applications, Nuxt provides the concept of modules. Let's go and take a look at what a module for Nuxt 3 looks like and how we can take code from our application and turn it into a reusable module. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel. So previously we built this cookie consent component inside of our application. If you want to go and get caught up on that, there is a link above on that video. But what we're going to do today is move this from being inside of our application. So over in our components, we've got our cookie consent, and inside of our plugins, we've got our cookie consent. This doesn't really lend itself to being very reusable if we've got multiple Nuxt applications that we want to use that same cookie consent component in. So what we really need to do is extract that out into a Nuxt 3 module so that we can then just install that into our application, or each application that we want it in. So it's much more portable and reusable. So the first thing that we need to do is we want to be outside of our Nuxt app itself, but still inside of our repository. So inside of our repository, we are not going to create a folder there. We are going to create a folder here called modules, and I'm just going to stop the app running and cd into that modules directory. And what we need to do is create our control and our module rather, and the way that we do that is using npx nuxi init, and we tell it that it's a module that we want to create and the name of the module that we want to create. So we want to create Nuxt cookie consent. So let's go and create that. Okay, so that's created, and what I'm going to do is reopen VS Code in that folder. So that is the root folder. Otherwise things like TypeScript and various other bits and pieces don't play so well. They can't find things in the right place where they're expecting it to do. Some of the VS Code extensions don't work so well. So open up your module as being your actual project that you're working on is my advice. So because we've opened up a new workspace, we need to go and do the same stuff that we have to do with a Nuxt 3 project, which is go and turn off the various other plugins that we don't want. So we disable that for the workspace, and we'll turn off the TypeScript and JavaScript features as well, which is what we have to do. And let's bring up our terminal, and we're in the Nuxt cookie consent. So let's just install our dependencies. While that's doing that, let's come over here and change the name from my module to what we want, which is Nuxt cookie consent. So that's our packages all installed. Now just a word of warning. The next bit I had some fun with because of the version of NPM that I was using. So I'm on 8.12.2. I was on 8.13, but this next bit where we have to prepare our dev environment. So we need to do an npm run dev prepare. And if we look in our package JSON, you'll see that there's a script for dev prepare that does some Nuxt magic for us to prepare things. But if you do this on 8.13, you get a big horrific error. So make sure you're on 8.12.2 for now. So we prepare our essentially playground environment. So this pre-builds a load of stuff that's in the code that's in our source folder is essentially what's going on here. And then once we've done that, we can then npm run dev as we would any other Nuxt project. This is actually going to run up this playground area here as an actual Nuxt application. So as we can see, we've got an app view, we've got a Nuxt config, we've got our own package.json. So it is a mini Nuxt 3 application here, and that's pulling in our module that's been built from this source folder here is what's going on. So if I browse to that site, what we see is Nuxt module playground, and if I come over to the app view, that's exactly what's in the app view here. And at the moment, all that's in this particular module is a plugin, and the plugin just writes to the console. So if I was to come over and bring up the developer tools, you can see there is the plugin that's actually being called. So we know that we're actually using our module. Okay, that's the beginnings of a module rather. What we need to do is go and set ourselves up ready for development. So we need to get things like ESLint and Prettier and all that kind of good stuff installed in this workspace that we've now got. So, and again, I've done this in a previous video, but we're just going to whip through it again here. So installing all the ESLint bits and pieces. We also, for our particular module in this case, we need Sass, we need Defu, and we need CSS vars ponyfill for the cookie consent piece. So here's just some other dependencies that we need for this particular module. You may not necessarily need these for your particular module. So I'm going to go and set up ESLint and Prettier and get VS Code all up and running, and then I'll come back and show you what I've done. Okay, so that's ESLint installed and Prettier installed. So now we can come over to some of our code files, and when we save them, they get nicely formatted up for us. So we are good to go. So what's next? Let's start actually digging into some of the actual code. So as I mentioned before, this is our test area, the playground. The source area is where we need to actually put our code that we want for this particular module. So let's get our component in here first. So under source runtime, I'm going to create a new folder called components. And from my existing Nuxt 3 application where I've got my cookie consent, I'm going to copy that component across. I'm also going to copy some other bits and pieces like the locale folder that we created. So we want that under the runtime folder so that we have all of the locale files for our cookie consent control. We've also got the CSS or the Sass that we need. So let's just put that under the runtime area as well. Let's also copy our plugin. So we've got this cookie consent plugin. So let's copy that over to the runtime as well. And let's get rid of that existing plugin and let's rename that one as plugin. So if we open this up, let's just save that so that that reorders that and gets rid of that for us. So now that's happy. So the first thing we're going to do is extract out all of these interfaces into a separate types file. So we create a new types file. We'll create an import for that up here so that we import what we need from it. And we're going to take all of these interfaces that we had in our plugin, extract all of those out into a types file. And that's because some of these types are shared across multiple files. So it makes it easier if that's in a separate file that you can then import across your various different parts of your module. So back over to our plugin, we've imported cookie options so it knows what that is. It's still happy that we're pulling all of that in. We've then got all of our methods as we would expect. So let's go down to where we actually define our plugin. So inside here we need to make a few changes. So the options are now no longer going to be stored in the public config area of the Nuxt config. So just to recap what we had previously, over in our Nuxt config, inside of our runtime config public area is where we put our cookie consent. We're actually going to move this out from being inside of here to at the root level. So it will move from there up to this level here. Okay, so that's the changes that we're going to make now. So let's just minimize that down. So this is no longer going to come from here. The cookie defaults are not going to be needed in here either. So we can get rid of all of those and we can replace this cookies definition here. All of the default values all disappear. All of that stays the same, apart from we need to get rid of this colors merging bit here. So if I paste over all of that, what you can see is that we're getting a public config and we're getting the cookie consent from it, and expanding that into our cookies object is all we're doing. So everything should be inside this cookie consent area here already set up for us by the time we come to the plugin, and that's going to be done by our module definition file that we're going to do in a while. So we're moving things around. All the same stuff is still happening. We still have to create our cookie consent configuration area. It's just that it's being done now by the module as opposed to us needing to do it inside the plugin itself. So it makes our plugin a little bit simpler. So now that we've done that, we can actually move on to creating a composable. So inside of the runtime, we can create a composables TypeScript file. A composable is as we've already seen with the use Nuxt app, for instance, you can use that inside of your code to easily get at the various parts of Nuxt. So what we're doing here is we are creating a new composable that you can use called use cookie consent that gives you back the $cookies object. Now we need to jump over to the module, and we need some more imports at the top of this file. So as we said, we imported defu earlier. So this is where we're now going to use this inside of this module definition here. We're pulling in some other bits and pieces from the package JSON. All of these are giving me warnings at the moment because they're not being used, but we're about to go and use those right now. Inside of our module definition, we've got the meta area. So let's just replace that with what we want. So the meta area defines all the information about your particular module. We're saying it's compatible with Nuxt 3. We're pulling name and version from the package.json and applying it here. So that gives us a nice to have. And we also set the config that we're going to use. So this is what the name of the config item will be inside the Nuxt config. So we're looking for a cookie consent configuration block now inside the Nuxt config. Moving on, we've now got a defaults area. So this is where we can move all of those defaults that we were doing inside of the plugin. We can essentially just copy inside of that block, get rid of what's there. And here we've got all our default colors. We get all our default properties. And then we move into the actual setup method itself. I'm going to change that to module options to make that a little bit clearer. And then we have a couple of utility methods that set up various different things. So a resolver, and we also get a path to our runtime folder in this runtime directory that we need for various other bits and pieces as we go through this. So let's build some of this up as we go. So we need to add the runtime directory into the transpile pipeline. We need to add our plugin into this particular module. So we tell it that it's called plugin and that it's in the runtime directory. So we can get rid of that now, and we need to add our components in. So we create another path to the components folder, and once we've got that, we can add our component into that. So it's called cookie consent and it's inside the components folder. We then need to add the composable that we added. So this is how we can add that composable in. So this is all the kind of stuff that you would typically do inside of your Nuxt config or something like that. It's just this module TS gives you the ability to instruct Nuxt at runtime to add all of this stuff in is all we're doing here. So back to the composable. The composable is called composables, and it just adds that in using that name. So we're instructing Nuxt all about how these things work and how they should be represented inside of Nuxt. We've got our CSS that we need to add in if we've requested CSS in the options. So we've got a parameter that says whether CSS or not is used. Then if it is, we push that in from the SAS file that we've got from the runtime directory. We push that into the Nuxt CSS area. So again, what you would normally do inside your Nuxt config is add that into the CSS collection. That's what that is doing. This next bit is specific to our particular plugin. So if we've requested locales, then again, we set the locales to a default option of English if you haven't overridden that option. And then this last block is basically going through exactly as it says, ensure the cookie config has the default. So it's going through, because what you specify inside of your Nuxt config might only be a partial configuration, so you might only set 2 or 3 properties. This goes through and makes sure that all the various different values that need to be there are actually populated with some default values, and then we override them with what comes from the configuration itself. This is for the necessary and the optional areas that define your cookies essentially. So that's very specific to this particular plugin again, or module. And then last but not least, this is how we share those options across with our particular plugin. So inside the Nuxt options, runtime config, public, cookie consent is where we paste in basically all of those options that we've now messed around with, made sure that it's fully populated, got all the default values. All of that stuff then gets dumped into this public runtime config area, which, if you remember from the plugin, is where that's actually coming from over here, the public config, cookie consent. So there is a direct correlation between those two. That's how you share your config from your module to your plugin, or one particular way that you can share your config to your plugin. And that should be it for our module. So let's save that and save that. And let's jump over to our Playground app view, and let's get rid of that. And let's try this out. So if I put a cookies value in there, and also include our cookie consent component, and then inside the script setup, we can use our composable to get hold of that cookies object here that's it's now warning me about. So let's sort that out. So using our composable, we can use our use cookie consent, and yes, this gives you a warning, but once we start running it and building it, it will resolve itself correctly. So let's save that. And let's come over to the Nuxt config. So if you remember, I said we would need at the top level of the Nuxt config now, rather than in that public runtime config, we have a cookie consent object. And this is basically where all of our configuration lives. So we could copy that directly from our application across to here, so that we get something that looks like this. So these are our necessary cookies. These are our optional cookies that people can opt in or out of. We don't want to show a control button on the screen, for instance. So that gives us some example Nuxt config that we can play around with in this particular playground. So let's npm run dev prepare and npm run dev and see what we get. You can see that now that we've done that dev prepare, it knows about our use cookie consent. Quite happy with that. So if we jump over here, we can see that we get our cookies being dumped out into the UI, and we're also seeing our cookie control coming from our Vue component. So that shows that we're seeing our plugin correctly. And if I was to, for instance, modal is set to false on there. If I jump onto manage cookies, I don't know how well you can see that, but that's changed under there to true because it's now showing the cookies, and I can unset and do everything that I would expect to do and save that, and my cookies appear over here. So everything is working exactly as it did in our application, but now it's inside of a Nuxt module. So given that, we need to go back and revisit our application, and instead of having the cookie consent directly inside the components and the plugins, we're going to import it in as a module. But before we can do that, we need to actually properly build this as a module. So let's come over to the package.json, and I'm just going to add in a few scripts. So I'm adding in a release script that does an npm pack. I'm also adding in two variations on that, one specifically for Windows and one specifically for Linux. And that's because of the different move commands that I need to use to actually move the resulting tar file that gets built into a release folder. So that's essentially what the npm pack is going to do for us. So if we create a new folder of release, and if I now npm run release Windows, and so that's done, and we can see that inside of our release folder we have our tar file at version 1.0.0. So that gives us our built module that we can use inside of our main application. So if I jump over to our main application now, cd into Nuxt app, then we can fix this up so that it works correctly with our module. So the first thing that we can do is uninstall the dependency that we now no longer need because it's coming from the module. So we can get rid of CSS vars, ponyfill, and we can install our plugin using npm install and then path it through the module's cookie consent release to that actual tarball that we created. So we can install it locally, but it's still a portable module, so it's easily copy and pasted somewhere else, and you can import this into another Nuxt application. Or if you want to, you can go the whole hog and upload it onto npm so that you can just npm it from there. We need to go and fix up our Nuxt config, and this has changed from cookie consent to cookie consent, but I should be able to collapse that whole block down to there, and that level, put that in there. So we've got exactly the same configuration, just slightly different name. And then, as we always do with modules, we need to go and actually add that into our modules collection. So that's the name of our module that we created. And then we can get rid of the styles SAS file because that's now inside of our module as well. So let's save that, and we can get rid of the plugin, and we can get rid of the component. So let's npm run dev on that, jump over to our main page, and let's just go and clear out any cookies that we've got and refresh that up. And again, we can see that our cookie consent is all working. We can manage that, and we see the cookies that we've actually got set up, which is good, and we can save that, and we get our cookie consent cookies being added into our application. So that is all up and running. So that is it. That is our Nuxt cookie consent component and plugin and composable now, all bundled nicely into a Nuxt module that we can reuse across our applications. All I have to do is copy that that modules folder across to the relevant project, and then I can just npm install that into the actual application. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, then please do consider liking it and subscribing to the channel, because there are more videos like this coming. And with that said, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.